The moment my husband brought another woman into our living room, handed her a glass of wine, and said, "You'll manage," something inside me went completely still. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't explain. He stood there like he was delegating a chore, not detonating a marriage. The woman beside him, his mistress, Kiara, smiled politely, like a guest who assumed the house already belonged to her. I remember the weight of the silence more than the words. The hum of the refrigerator. The clink of ice in her glass. Damien didn't look nervous. He looked relieved. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I nodded once, because that's what I'd done for years, managed. Bills. Schedules. His mother's appointments. His business messes. The quiet gaps he never noticed because I filled them before they became problems. Kiara took a slow look around the room. The couch I chose. The art I paid for. She didn't ask if I was staying. She assumed. I excused myself and walked upstairs, my legs steady in a way that surprised me. In the bedroom, I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed. My hands were calm. That scared me more than anger would have. Downstairs, I could hear Damien talking, explaining logistics like this was a handoff. I realized then he didn't know what I actually did. He thought I was support. He never saw the structure. Later that night, I called my friend Ray. I didn't tell her everything. I just said, "He thinks I'll manage." There was a pause on the line. Then Ray said, "Only what's yours?" I lay awake until morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying his voice. "You'll manage." By sunrise, I understood something Damien never had. Management is a choice. And I was done choosing him. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories coming soon. Before everything broke, my life looked quiet from the outside. Stable. Respectable. We lived on the south side of Chicago, Illinois, in a brick house that everyone assumed ran on routine and love. The truth was simpler. It ran on me. I'm Tanisha Jackson, and for most of my marriage, I believed being steady was the same as being valued. My husband, Damien Jackson, liked to tell people he was the provider. He said it with confidence, like repetition made it real. I never corrected him. I handled the parts that didn't photograph well. Damien worked in small business deals that always sounded promising and never quite landed. I paid bills on time. I smoothed over late notices. I kept spreadsheets no one asked for and solved problems before they became arguments. When his mother, Tamara Jackson, needed help, I arranged doctors, insurance calls, and groceries. Damien called it family duty. I called it Tuesday. Our house reflected that balance. Clean, organized, predictable. I chose the furniture. I tracked the expenses. Damien liked to relax there, stretching out like the place existed for his comfort alone. In a way, he wasn't wrong. I had a friend who noticed things. Ray Underwood had known me since before my marriage, before I learned to shrink my needs to keep peace. Ray used to joke that I ran a one-woman operations department. I laughed, because it sounded better than admitting I was tired. Back then, I still believed effort guaranteed security. I believed that if I kept managing, nothing important would collapse. I didn't know I was holding up a structure that wasn't grateful. I just knew that, at the time, walking away never crossed my mind. Not yet. Damien's entitlement didn't arrive all at once. It grew quietly, fed by convenience and my silence. At dinners with friends, he spoke over me when money came up. If someone asked how we stayed organized, he smiled and said, "I'm just good with numbers." I watched heads nod while I passed the bread, letting the lie settle because correcting him felt petty. I told myself it didn't matter. It did. At home, decisions stopped being discussions. Damien bought things without checking balances, assuming there was room. When I mentioned budgets, he waved it off. "You'll figure it out," he said, like that was reassurance instead of dismissal. I started noticing patterns. When problems appeared, Damien disappeared. Late notices showed up in the mail, and he acted surprised. Calls from vendors came to my phone, not his. He didn't even know who our insurance agent was. He never learned, because he never had to. Tamara added another layer. She treated my help as expected, not offered. If an appointment ran late or a prescription needed refilling, my phone rang. Damien called it respect. I called it unpaid responsibility. The first time I tried to push back, gently, Damien laughed. "Why are you making this harder than it needs to be?" he asked. That question stayed with me. Not because it was cruel, but because it was honest. My effort made his life easier. That was the point. I mentioned it to Ray one afternoon over coffee. I said I felt invisible in my own marriage. Ray didn't rush to comfort me. She asked, if you stopped doing everything, what would happen? I didn't have an answer. The thought scared me. The house. The bills. His mother. The business. It all felt fragile. So I kept managing. And Damien kept assuming. Neither of us realized the cost of that assumption. Not yet. The signs of another woman didn't arrive as lipstick on a collar or secret phone calls. They showed up as absence. Damien started coming home later, always with a reason that sounded rehearsed. Meetings ran long. A client needed dinner. Traffic was bad. His phone stayed face down on the counter, buzzing just enough to be noticed, never enough to explain. I told myself not to be suspicious. I wasn't naive, but I believed in proof. Without it, doubt felt like betrayal on my part. So I focused on what I could control. I kept the house running. I paid down a credit card Damien said was temporary. I covered a business expense he promised to reimburse. Tamara noticed before I did. She asked one evening why Damien smelled like unfamiliar perfume. I shrugged it off. I said maybe it was someone at work. Tamara nodded, satisfied. She trusted her son in the way people trust what benefits them. Ray wasn't convinced. She asked pointed questions. Had Damien been distant? Defensive? Secretive with money? I answered carefully, like honesty might summon something I wasn't ready to face. The truth was, Damien had already left emotionally. I could feel it in the way he barely looked at me when I spoke. In how his patience thinned only with me, never with anyone else. I started feeling like background noise in my own home. One night, I sat at the kitchen table balancing accounts while Damien laughed at something on his phone in the other room. The sound didn't belong to us. It was lighter. Freer. That was the first time a quiet thought crossed my mind. If there is someone else, she has no idea what she's inheriting. I pushed the thought away. I wasn't ready to imagine what came next. But the structure was already cracking. And I was still holding it up alone. The first open humiliation came at a family gathering I hadn't even wanted to attend. Tamara insisted on hosting a small dinner for one of Damien's cousins. Nothing formal. Just food, drinks, and the usual performance of togetherness. I cooked most of it myself, because that was easier than arguing. Damien arrived late, of course, acting like his presence alone was a favor. Halfway through the evening, his phone rang. He didn't silence it. He glanced at the screen, smiled, and stepped outside to take the call. No apology. No explanation. I noticed the pause in the room. The way conversations dipped, then restarted. Monisha Cedarfield, our neighbor, raised her eyebrows at me from across the table. I pretended not to see it. When Damien came back in, he was lighter. Distracted. He barely touched his food. Tamara leaned over and asked if everything was okay. Damien said, yeah. Just handling something. Handling. The word landed wrong. Later, while I cleared plates, I heard Tamara telling someone that Damien had a lot going on and that I was good at keeping things together. She said it like praise. Like a job description. Ray texted me during dessert. You okay? I stared at the message longer than necessary. Then I typed, I'm fine. I wasn't. That night, after everyone left, Damien didn't thank me. He didn't mention the food or the cleanup. He kissed my cheek absently and went upstairs, already checked out. I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by evidence of effort no one noticed. The sink full. The counters wiped clean. The quiet hum of appliances doing their jobs. For the first time, resentment surfaced clearly. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. I realized then that Damien wasn't hiding another life from me. He was practicing living it right in front of me. And trusting I'd stay silent. Like I always had. The money problems started surfacing right after that dinner, like consequences testing the water. A letter from a vendor arrived marked past due. Then another. I opened them quietly, the way I always did, and logged the balances into my spreadsheet. Damien hadn't mentioned any of it. When I asked, casually, he said it was a delay. A timing issue. He said not to worry. I worried anyway. I checked our accounts more closely than usual and noticed gaps. Payments I'd assumed Damien was covering hadn't been touched in months. A loan tied to his business had rolled into default status without a single alert going to him. Everything had been routed to my email years ago, back when he said it was easier if I handled the admin side. He didn't know what existed unless I told him. When I brought it up that evening, Damien sighed like I was exhausting him. "Why are you digging so hard?" he asked. "It's handled." That word again. Handled meant me. Tamara called the next day asking if I'd scheduled her prescription refill. She didn't ask Damien. She never did. I said yes, even though I hadn't yet, and hung up feeling smaller than I ever had. I went for a walk after work and called Ray. I told her something felt wrong. Not just emotionally. Structurally. Like the foundation of our life was cracking, and Damien was pretending not to hear it. Ray didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, "You know you're propping everything up, right?" I stopped walking. That was the first time someone said it out loud. And once it was said, I couldn't unhear it. I went home that night and looked at Damien differently. Not with love. Not with suspicion. With measurement. I didn't know what I was measuring yet. Only that something was about to give. The realization didn't make me dramatic. It made me quiet. I stopped filling gaps automatically. Just small ones at first. I didn't remind Damien about a deadline he'd mentioned in passing. I didn't move money around to cover a shortfall the moment I noticed it. I waited. Nothing happened. Not because things were fine, but because Damien didn't notice. Days passed. Then weeks. Notices sat unopened on the counter while he stepped over them on his way out the door. Tamara's pharmacy called twice before I returned the message. No one else followed up. The house still looked the same. That was the illusion. From the outside, everything held. Inside, threads were loosening. Damien grew more distracted. He smiled at his phone more than he smiled at me. Conversations turned shallow. Logistics replaced intimacy. When I tried to talk about us, he said I was overthinking. When I asked where he'd been, he said, out. That was it. Just out. One evening, I overheard him in the garage, voice low, laughing in a way he hadn't laughed with me in years. I didn't strain to hear names. I didn't need to. Instead, I went upstairs and opened my laptop. I pulled up years of records. Accounts. Payments. Transfers. Patterns I'd built slowly, patiently, without realizing they were leverage. For the first time, I saw the full shape of what I carried. And what would happen if I put it down. I didn't act yet. I wasn't ready. But something shifted permanently that night. I stopped seeing myself as support. I started seeing myself as infrastructure. And infrastructure, once removed, doesn't make noise. It makes collapse. I closed the laptop and went to bed beside a man who had no idea how much of his life rested on my silence. Not for long. The day Damien brought her home didn't feel sudden to him. It felt scheduled. I came back earlier than usual, arms full of groceries, already thinking about what needed to be prepped for the week. When I opened the front door, I heard unfamiliar laughter. Light. Confident. Not trying to hide. They were in the living room. Damien stood near the window like he was waiting for applause. Beside him was Kiara Clark, dressed like she belonged there already, holding a wine glass I recognized from our cabinet. My cabinet. Damien didn't look embarrassed. He looked efficient. "Hey," he said. "This is Kiara." He didn't explain who she was. He didn't need to. Then he added, casually, "She'll be staying for a while. You'll manage." The words landed clean and sharp. Kiara smiled at me the way people smile when they assume compliance. She took a slow sip, eyes scanning the room like inventory. She didn't ask if I was okay. She didn't ask where I was going. Damien talked next. About space. About honesty. About how this was better than lying. He framed it like growth. Like I should be proud of his transparency. I stood there longer than necessary, absorbing the math of it. He wasn't asking. He wasn't negotiating. He was reassigning roles. I set the grocery bags down carefully. My hands didn't shake. I felt oddly clear. "I need a minute," I said. Damien nodded, already turning back to Kiara. He assumed I'd return. Upstairs, I closed the bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I listened. Downstairs, Damien explained how things worked. What I handled. What Kiara wouldn't need to worry about. That was the moment I understood something important. He thought management was automatic. He didn't know it was consent. And I was done giving it. I didn't leave that night. Not because I was weak, but because I was observant. I stayed upstairs and listened to the house move without me. Kiara laughed too loudly. Damien poured another drink. Doors opened and closed with a confidence that didn't belong to them yet. I lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling, cataloging sounds the way I cataloged expenses. Control doesn't disappear in chaos. It reveals itself. At some point, Damien came upstairs. He stood in the doorway like he was checking on an appliance. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said. Not if. When. He assumed time was on his side. I nodded. Silence was easier than arguing with someone who thought the outcome was fixed. After he left, I opened my laptop again. Not to cry into it. To inventory. I pulled records I hadn't touched in months. I made copies. I saved files to a separate drive. Years of unpaid labor crystallized into numbers and dates. Downstairs, Kiara walked into a house she didn't understand. She saw comfort. She didn't see obligations. She didn't hear the emails or field the calls. She didn't know which accounts were balanced by intention and which by quiet sacrifice. I texted Ray one sentence, "He brought her home." Ray called immediately. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready for emotion. I needed clarity first. Near midnight, the house went quiet. Damien assumed I was sleeping. He assumed I'd process this the way I processed everything else, internally, invisibly, efficiently. Instead, I made a list. What was mine? What wasn't? What stopped the moment I did? I slept for a few hours. Light. Alert. By morning, I wasn't shocked anymore. I was strategic. And that scared me, in a good way. Morning exposed the fantasy Damien was living in. Kiara came downstairs wrapped in one of my robes, barefoot, comfortable. She made coffee without asking where anything was, pressing buttons until the machine responded. Damien watched her like this was proof he'd made the right decision. Neither of them looked at me when I entered the kitchen. Damien spoke first, calm and managerial. "We should set some ground rules," he said. "This doesn't have to be hostile." Hostile. As if the betrayal had been a misunderstanding. I listened. I didn't interrupt. He talked about space, timelines, and expectations. He said I could stay for now. He said we'd figure things out. He said, "You're good at handling details." That was when I realized something important. He still expected me to manage the fallout. I asked one question. "Do you know how much your business account overdrafts if I don't move money today?" Damien frowned. He glanced at Kiara, then back at me. "What do you mean?" I let the silence stretch. "Not as punishment. As information." I said evenly, that nothing you're standing on is automatic. Kiara shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the version she'd been sold. She expected drama, not math. Damien scoffed and waved it off. "You're being dramatic." I nodded again. I'd learned that nodding unsettled him when there was nothing behind it. I finished my coffee, set the mug in the sink, and went upstairs. In the bedroom, I packed slowly. Not everything. Just what was mine. Clothes I bought. Documents in my name. Jewelry gifted to me. I left joint items untouched, right where they were. Before leaving the room, I took photos. Evidence, not memories. Downstairs, Damien laughed at something Kiara said. He still thought this was a conversation. He didn't understand it was a countdown. I didn't announce my departure. I prepared it. While Damien and Kiara settled into their new normal downstairs, I worked quietly. I pulled a binder from the hall cabinet, the one Damien never touched because it looked boring. Inside were years of records. I updated it carefully, labeling sections with dates and descriptions. Mortgage contributions. Medical bills. Business loans. His mother's expenses. All the things I covered without asking for credit. On the kitchen table, I laid out what I was leaving behind. Furniture purchased jointly. Appliances. Shared accounts. I itemized everything, not to be kind, but to be precise. Precision removes arguments. On the last page of the binder, I wrote a single sentence in clean handwriting: "Management ends today." I placed my keys beside it. Not slammed. Not thrown. Set down. Ray pulled up outside just after noon. I didn't hug her. Not yet. She took one look at my face and nodded. She didn't ask if I was sure. She helped me load my car efficiently, respectfully, like this was a transition, not a breakdown. Damien finally noticed when the front door closed behind me. He stepped onto the porch, confused, irritated. "Where are you going?" he asked. I turned back once. "You said I'd manage." Then I got in the car. I watched the house in the rearview mirror as we drove away. It looked exactly the same. Solid. Unchanged. That was the illusion. Because inside that house, the quiet systems had already shut down. Bills would go unpaid. Calls would go unanswered. Responsibilities would surface with no one to catch them. Kiara moved in expecting comfort. She didn't know she was stepping into a vacancy. As we merged onto the street, my phone buzzed. A bank alert. A missed call. Another alert. I didn't answer. For the first time in years, I wasn't managing anything. And everything was about to feel it. Leaving didn't feel like freedom at first. It felt like exposure. Ray drove while I stared out the window, watching the city move like nothing had changed. People walked dogs. Buses stopped and started. Somewhere, Damien was still standing in a house that assumed my return. We went to Ray's apartment. Temporary. Neutral. She didn't offer platitudes. She handed me a glass of water and said, "Sit. Breathe. Then we plan." That word landed differently now. My phone buzzed nonstop. Missed calls. Voicemails. Notifications from accounts I hadn't touched since morning. I turned the phone face down. Not avoidance. Prioritization. Ray opened her laptop and slid it toward me. Start with what stops today, she said. I did. I listed everything I handled that Damien believed was automatic. Payments scheduled under my name. Vendor contacts only I knew. Renewals I tracked mentally. His mother's pharmacy account. His business bookkeeping login. Each item felt heavier once written down, like lifting pieces of a structure and realizing how much weight they carried. Ray didn't react emotionally. She asked practical questions. Is this joint? Is this in your name? Who gets notified if this lapses? By the end of the list, the room felt quiet in a different way. This isn't revenge, Ray said finally. This is withdrawal. That night, I sent one email. Not to Damien. To myself. A time-stamped summary of what I'd stopped managing and when. Clean. Factual. No commentary. Documentation creates gravity. I slept on Ray's couch, light but uninterrupted. In the morning, my phone was still buzzing. One voicemail slipped through. Damien's voice sounded strained. Confused. Not angry yet. Hey, things are acting weird, he said. Did you move something? I stared at the ceiling and smiled faintly. For the first time, Damien wasn't delegating. He was noticing. And that meant the collapse had officially begun. The first consequence arrived quietly, disguised as confusion. A notification popped up just after noon. A business account overdraft alert. Not my problem anymore, but still my information. I archived it without opening the details. Control now meant restraint. Ray watched me do it and nodded. Let it land, she said. Damien called again. This time I answered. Something's wrong, he said immediately. No greeting. No apology. The bank froze a transfer. Vendors are calling. Did you change passwords? I kept my voice level. I didn't change anything. That was true. I don't understand, he said. You always handled this. There it was. Not gratitude. Assumption. I handled what was mine to handle, I replied. I'm not in the house anymore. Silence stretched on the line. I imagined him standing in the kitchen, notices spread out, Kiara nearby pretending not to listen. You can't just stop, he said finally. There are obligations. Yes, I said. There are. He hung up without saying goodbye. Ray raised an eyebrow. First fracture, she said. That afternoon, a pharmacy number flashed on my phone. Tamara's prescription. I let it go to voicemail. Then another call. Then a text asking if I'd forgotten. I forwarded the message to Damien. One line. Please handle this going forward. No commentary. No explanation. By evening, my inbox filled with follow-ups. Reminders. Soft warnings turning firm. Systems noticing absence. Ray helped me set up a clean folder system. Everything incoming, nothing answered unless legally required. Patterns over panic. This is the dangerous part, Ray said. They'll push before they adjust. I believed her. That night, a new voicemail arrived. Damien again. This time, irritation edged into his voice. You're doing this on purpose. I deleted it. Intent didn't matter. Impact did. And the impact was finally reaching him. By the third day, the tone shifted. Damien stopped sounding confused and started sounding offended, like a customer upset that a service had been interrupted without notice. His messages grew sharper. Shorter. He accused me of being irresponsible, then of being petty. He never once asked how I was. Kiara tried next. Her number came through late afternoon. Unknown at first, then followed by a text. We need to talk like adults. I didn't respond. Ray noticed my jaw tighten and said, let me hear it. She put the call on speaker when Kiara rang again. Kiara's voice was measured, rehearsed. I think there's been a misunderstanding, she said. Damien is under a lot of stress. You stopping things is creating problems. I waited a beat. What things? Another pause. Bills. His mother's medication. The business account. I looked at Ray. She smiled slightly. I don't manage those anymore, I said. I moved out. That doesn't mean you get to abandon responsibilities, Kiara replied. I kept my voice even. Which responsibilities are legally mine? Silence. Ray leaned in and whispered, good. Kiara cleared her throat. We're just asking for some cooperation. I ended the call. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Just finished. That evening, Ray helped me pull credit reports. Not out of panic. Out of foresight. We found accounts I didn't recognize. Lines opened under joint authority. Balances creeping upward without my oversight. This is where it turns, Ray said. From inconvenience to exposure. I felt it too. The shift from emotional fallout to documented risk. I created another folder. Screenshots. Statements. Dates. Downstairs in that house, Kiara was learning something Damien had never bothered to explain. Comfort wasn't permanent. It had a manager. And the manager was gone. The pressure didn't stay private for long. On the fourth day, Monisha, our neighbor, texted me a photo. A tow notice taped to the side of Damien's work truck. No caption. Just proof. I stared at the image longer than I expected. Not with satisfaction. With confirmation. Ray leaned over my shoulder. That's fast, she said. Means he was already behind. That mattered. It meant this wasn't collapse by revenge. It was exposure by absence. Damien showed up at Ray's apartment that evening without warning. He looked tired. Rumpled. Smaller somehow. He didn't bring Kiara. This is embarrassing, he said the moment I opened the door. No hello. No apology. People are starting to notice. Ray stayed seated at the table, silent but present. I didn't embarrass you, I said. I left. He scoffed. You know what I mean. I did. He meant the illusion breaking. You can't just disappear from shared responsibilities, Damien continued. There are legal implications. That word again. Legal. The one he used without understanding. I've documented everything I paid for, I said calmly. What was joint? What wasn't? His face tightened. Are you threatening me? No, I said. I'm clarifying. Damien's voice dropped. This isn't how adults handle conflict. Ray finally spoke. Actually, this is exactly how adults handle dependency. Damien turned toward her, startled. He hadn't calculated witnesses. I need time, he said, softer now. Just until things stabilize. I shook my head. Stability isn't my job anymore. He stood there a moment longer, searching for leverage that wasn't there. Then he left, empty-handed. After the door closed, my phone buzzed. Another alert. Another missed payment. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. Because now, there were witnesses. And witnesses change outcomes. The next escalation came dressed as concern. Tamara called early the following morning, her voice tight and disapproving. I don't understand what's going on, she said. The pharmacy says my account is flagged. Damien says you stopped helping. There it was. Framed as neglect. I didn't stop helping, I replied. I moved out. That doesn't change family, Tamara snapped. I took a breath. It changes access. Silence followed, heavy and offended. Tamara had never needed to understand systems. She only needed them to work. You know Damien is overwhelmed, she said. This is not the time to make statements. This was the time. I've sent everything to Damien, I said. He has the information he needs. Tamara scoffed. He doesn't know how to handle those things. I closed my eyes briefly. That sentence explained years. Then he'll learn, I said. She hung up on me. Ray watched the exchange from the kitchen. That was a transfer attempt, she said. Guilt instead of logic. I nodded. They're circling. That afternoon, I met Tobias Merrick's son, an attorney Ray had worked with before. Neutral office. Neutral tone. I didn't bring emotion. I brought documents. Tobias flipped through the binder slowly. He didn't rush. He didn't interrupt. When he finished, he looked up and said, "You've been subsidizing multiple adults." That sentence landed harder than any insult. What do I need to do? I asked. Nothing dramatic, Tobias said. Just stop covering. And don't destroy records. I smiled faintly. Already done. He nodded. Good. Because once creditors notice patterns, they stop calling you and start calling him. As we left, Ray squeezed my arm. This is the turn, she said. I felt it too. Not revenge. Leverage. The calls shifted after that. Where confusion had lived, urgency took its place. Damien stopped asking why and started asking how. How to reverse fees. How to speak to creditors. How to access accounts he'd never bothered to learn. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded one email from Tobias to Damien. Short. Professional. It stated that I was no longer managing shared obligations and that all future communication should be directed to him directly. No accusations. No emotion. Damien showed up at my work the next day. That crossed a line. He waited near the entrance, pacing like proximity alone would restore control. When I stepped outside, he launched in immediately. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said. We can handle this privately. We are handling it privately, I replied. You just don't like the terms. People past us. Damien lowered his voice. Kiara is freaking out. Creditors are calling the house. This isn't fair. Fair. The word felt misplaced. She moved into a situation she didn't understand, I said. So did you. His jaw clenched. You're enjoying this. I met his eyes. No. I'm surviving it. That threw him. He'd expected cruelty. Anger. Drama. He didn't know what to do with calm boundaries. That evening, Ray and I reviewed timelines. Dates of missed payments. When alerts escalated. When calls switched from reminders to warnings. Patterns were forming. This is when they start documenting, Ray said. And documentation outlives emotion. My phone buzzed again. A new voicemail. Not Damien. A creditor. Calm. Professional. Asking to confirm his contact information going forward. I saved the message and forwarded it to Tobias. The system was adjusting. Slowly. Precisely. And once systems adjust, they don't revert for sentiment. I slept that night without checking my phone. For the first time since leaving, I felt something close to peace. Because the work was no longer mine. And the consequences finally were. The first threat arrived disguised as reconciliation. Damien texted just after midnight. We need to talk. Calmly. Foreclosure. I didn't respond. The next message came an hour later. You're putting yourself at risk. This can get ugly. There it was. Control slipping into intimidation. Ray read the messages over my shoulder and said, save everything. I did. Screenshots. Timestamps. Context. Not because I was scared, but because patterns matter. The following afternoon, Damien left a voicemail that sounded practiced. His voice was softer, slower. I've spoken to someone, he said. They told me you could be liable if this keeps escalating. I don't want it to go there. Someone. Another vague authority meant to scare me into resuming labor. I forwarded the voicemail to Tobias. His reply came back within the hour. One sentence. He's posturing. That word grounded me. That evening, Kiara tried again. Not a call this time. An email. Long, emotional. She wrote about stress. About misunderstanding. About how none of this had to be public. Public. They were worried about optics now. I read it once. Then archived it without replying. Ray watched me and smiled. You're doing exactly what systems reward, she said. Consistency. Later that night, Monisha texted again. This time, no photo. Just words. Sheriff left paperwork on their door today. Damien looked panicked. I stared at the screen, my chest tight but steady. This was the midpoint approaching. The moment when inconvenience turns into consequence. I didn't celebrate. I acknowledged. Because the threats had stopped being personal. They were procedural now. And procedures don't negotiate. They move forward. With or without permission. And Damien was finally learning what I'd known for years. Silence, when documented, is power. The paperwork changed everything. Monisha didn't know what kind it was. She just knew it came from the sheriff's office, delivered mid-morning, folded and official. She described Damien pacing the porch afterward, phone pressed to his ear, Kiara standing behind him with her arms crossed. That image stayed with me. Ray and I sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling between us, as Tobias explained what it likely meant. Once creditors escalate to service, he said, the story stops being personal. It becomes a record. A record doesn't care who feels wronged. Damien called that afternoon. I let it ring twice before answering. This has gone too far, he said. No greeting. His voice was tight, controlled with effort. There are documents now. Deadlines. Yes, I said. That's how systems work. You planned this, he snapped. You waited and let things fall apart. I didn't correct him. I let the silence stretch until it forced him to keep talking. I need you to come back, he said finally. Just temporarily. To help straighten this out. There it was. The trap dressed as compromise. I won't, I said. Kiara's voice broke through in the background. Say something, Damien covered the phone. When he came back, his tone shifted again. You're leaving me no choice. I pictured Tobias's email. He's posturing. You always have choices, I said. You just don't like the ones that don't involve me fixing things. He hung up. Ray exhaled slowly. That was the escalation. I nodded. The midpoint wasn't explosive. It was structural. Damien had crossed from denial into consequence. And the moment he threatened action, he lost control of the narrative. Because now, the next move wouldn't be his. It would be the system's. And systems don't get tired. They close in. The countermoves came fast after that, clumsy and poorly aimed. Damien filed first. Not for divorce, he wasn't ready for that reality, but for an emergency motion claiming I'd abandoned shared responsibilities. Tobias explained it calmly when he called. It's not strong, he said. But it tells us his strategy. He wants to scare you back into position. Position. Like I'd wandered away from a post. Ray sat beside me as I read the filing. The language was dramatic. Urgent. Vague. It talked about harm without naming specifics. Systems hate vagueness. This is noise, Ray said. He's trying to create leverage where none exists. Still, it counted as escalation. I responded the same way I had to everything else, documentation. Tobias filed a clean reply. Attachments only. Payment histories. Proof of who paid what and when. Screenshots of Damien's own messages admitting I handled everything. No insults. No narrative. Just facts. That evening, Damien left a voicemail that sounded different. Less confident. They're asking questions, he said. About accounts. About timing. I didn't know how to answer. That wasn't my problem. Kiara tried once more. She showed up at Ray's building, unannounced, waiting by the entrance like proximity would create authority. Ray handled it before I even reached the door. You need to leave, Ray told her. Calm. Firm. Witnessed. Kiara scoffed. She's destroying his life. Ray didn't blink. She stopped running it. Kiara left without another word. That night, Tobias emailed again. One sentence this time. His filing triggered deeper review. I closed my laptop and leaned back on the couch. My body felt tired, but my mind was clear. The fear to power shift was complete. Damien was no longer steering. He was reacting. And every reaction created another record he couldn't erase. For the first time, I understood something fully. I wasn't dismantling his life. I was letting it stand on its own. And it couldn't. The house stopped being quiet after that. Monisha sent another message, this time a short video. A creditor's car parked out front. Voices raised. Damien gesturing sharply, like frustration could negotiate deadlines. Kiara stood near the door, arms wrapped around herself now, no longer comfortable enough to wander. I watched once. Then deleted it. Not because I didn't care, but because watching wasn't the point. Ray and I focused on tightening boundaries. I updated my address with banks tied only to my name. I closed access where I could, cleanly and legally. Tobias reviewed everything before it went out. No missteps. No openings. This part feels boring, Ray said. That's how you know it's working. Damien called again, this time late, his voice unsteady. They're saying my accounts might be flagged, he said. You know how to talk to them. Just tell me what to say. I thought about all the nights I'd stayed up fixing things he never learned to understand. You tell the truth, I said. Or you let it play out. That's not help, he snapped. No, I replied. It's autonomy. He hung up hard. The next morning, Tobias forwarded a notice. A formal request for records. Specific. Detailed. Triggered by inconsistencies. Exactly the kind that doesn't go away. This is the point of no return, Tobias wrote. Once they start lining up timelines, intent becomes irrelevant. I felt my chest tighten, not with fear, but with finality. That afternoon, Kiara emailed again. Just one sentence this time. We didn't know it was this bad. I didn't reply. Because now she did. And knowledge doesn't move backward. That evening, as the sun dipped behind Ray's building, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't waiting for justice anymore. Justice had already started moving. All I had to do now was stay out of its way. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chaos before it. No calls from Damien. No messages from Kiara. Even Tamara went quiet. Systems had stepped in, and suddenly no one knew who to pressure anymore. When blame has nowhere to land, people retreat. Ray noticed it first. This is the lull, she said. They're regrouping. I used the time the way I'd learned to use everything else, intentionally. With Tobias's guidance, I requested formal copies of records tied to accounts opened during the marriage. Not accusations. Requests. Paper trails have a way of telling stories without emotion. We found overlaps. Debts created while Damien claimed stability. Expenses I'd unknowingly absorbed while his risk-taking continued unchecked. This matters, Tobias said. Because it shows reliance. Reliance. Not partnership. That afternoon, Damien broke the silence with an email. Short. Careful. Written like it had been reviewed by someone else. We should consider mediation before this gets worse. I read it twice. Mediation only sounds reasonable when leverage is gone. I forwarded it to Tobias without comment. His response came back measured. We'll respond when required. Not before. Ray smiled when I told her. You're no longer reacting. You're pacing. That night, I sat alone on the balcony and watched the city settle. Lights flickered on in windows. Lives moved forward without noticing mine had fractured and reformed at the same time. For the first time since Damien said you'll manage, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the next blow. I felt like I was standing on solid ground, watching someone else struggle to find it. The fear was gone now. In its place was something quieter. Certainty. Because whatever move Damien made next, it wouldn't be a surprise. It would be a response. And responses are always weaker than strategy. The regrouping didn't last long. 2 days later, Tobias called with an edge I hadn't heard before. They've shifted tactics, he said. Damien's attorney is requesting expedited mediation and temporary relief. Relief. From consequences. Ray listened quietly as I put the call on speaker. Tobias explained that Damien was arguing hardship. Cash flow collapse. Emotional distress. Disruption caused by my sudden withdrawal. They're reframing dependency as abandonment, Tobias said. It's common. And weak. Weak didn't mean harmless. We prepared anyway. Tobias asked for one thing I hadn't yet given him, the binder. Not copies. The original. I brought it to his office that afternoon. He didn't rush through it like before. He cross-checked entries against statements, dates against filings. Every few pages, he paused and nodded. This is unusually clean, he said. Most people don't document unpaid labor this clearly. I didn't know it was labor at the time, I replied. I thought it was marriage. He slid the binder closed. That distinction matters now. On the way out, my phone buzzed. A text from Tamara. Short. Sharp. You've gone too far. I didn't answer. Ray glanced at the screen and shook her head. They always reach for the oldest lever. That evening, Damien tried one more angle. He emailed saying he'd made mistakes and wanted to reset. No apology. No accountability. Just language shaped to reopen access. I forwarded it to Tobias. He replied with a single line, noted. That word felt final. Because nothing in that house could be reset anymore. Not finances. Not roles. Not expectations. What Damien wanted was management. What he was getting was review. And review doesn't negotiate feelings. It measures damage. And assigns responsibility. The review started pulling threads Damien didn't know existed. Tobias called early the next morning. Creditors aren't just asking about balances anymore, he said. They're asking how things were sustained for so long. That question changes tone. It moves focus from failure to dependency. We met again at his office, Ray with me this time. Tobias laid out a timeline across the conference table. Payments I'd made personally. Transfers that covered shortfalls. Gaps that only stayed invisible because I filled them. This shows a pattern, Tobias said. He wasn't managing a business. He was being subsidized. Subsidized. The word stripped the romance from everything Damien had claimed. That afternoon, a notice arrived addressed to me by mistake. An inquiry asking me to confirm whether I was still authorizing certain payments. I forwarded it to Tobias untouched. He responded quickly. This helps. By evening, Damien's panic surfaced publicly. Monisha texted again. Moving boxes. Loud argument. Kiara crying. I imagined the scene clearly. Comfort turning into confrontation. Expectations colliding with reality. Ray watched my face and said, "You okay?" "I am," I said. And I was surprised to find it true. Because this part wasn't about him anymore. It was about the story solidifying into record. That night, Damien left another voicemail. He sounded exhausted. "They're asking about you," he said. "About why you paid for things. About why I didn't. I didn't call back. Answers given late don't undo years of silence. They just expose it." I slept deeply that night. Because I knew something Damien didn't yet understand. Once institutions see who carried the weight, they don't unsee it. And once they know who didn't, they stop pretending. The balance had shifted. Not loudly. Permanently. The mediation notice arrived the following morning. Formal. Neutral. Scheduled 2 weeks out. Enough time for panic to ferment. Tobias explained what Damien was likely hoping for. "He wants you back in the room," he said. "Visibility feels like leverage to people who've lost control." I understood that instinct. Damien believed proximity created obligation. That if he could speak to me directly, I'd soften. Resume. Repair. He still didn't understand the difference between access and authority. Ray helped me prepare without dramatizing it. We reviewed what wouldn't happen before what would. No emotional testimony. No revisiting betrayal. No defending my decision to leave. Just facts. Timelines. Records. "That's how you keep this from turning into theater," Ray said. That afternoon, Kiara emailed again. Longer this time. Less defensive. She wrote about being overwhelmed. About not knowing Damien's finances were complicated. About feeling misled. I read it slowly. Not with anger. With distance. I replied with one sentence: "I managed what I was responsible for." Nothing more. Her response never came. That evening, Damien tried a new tone in voicemail. Almost pleading. "I don't recognize you anymore," he said. "This isn't who you are." I let the message sit. People always confuse boundaries with personality change. Later, Tobias forwarded an update. A creditor had requested sworn statements regarding payment history. Names. Dates. Intent. "This is where truth hardens," he wrote. I closed my laptop and leaned back on the couch. My body felt tired in a deep, earned way. Because what was happening now didn't require my energy. It required my consistency. And I finally had enough of that to last. The sworn statement request stripped away the last illusion of control. Tobias walked me through it line by line. No embellishment. No narrative. Just confirmation of facts that already existed. What I paid. When I paid it. Under whose authority. And when that authority ended. Truth doesn't need momentum, Tobias said. It just needs to be consistent. I signed and dated the statement without hesitation. Ray watched quietly. When we left the office, she exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for weeks. "That locks it," she said. "He can't outrun that." Damien tried anyway. He sent a message that night accusing me of turning people against him. Of rewriting history. Of punishing him instead of working things out like a family. I didn't respond. Because families don't run on coercion. The next morning, Monisha texted one final update. "House is tense." Kiara left with bags. Didn't say goodbye. I sat with that longer than I expected. Not with satisfaction. With clarity. Kiara hadn't lost comfort because of me. She'd lost it because it never belonged to her. Ray poured coffee and said gently, "You ready for what comes next?" I nodded. I was. Later that afternoon, Tobias forwarded another notice. Mediation was no longer optional. Creditors had attached conditions. Timelines tightened. Requests multiplied. "This is where it shifts from negotiation to consequence," he wrote. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. I wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about inevitability. Everything Damien had avoided learning was being taught at once. By people who didn't care about his excuses. Or his anger. Or his regret. All they cared about was who carried responsibility. And now, that answer was written down. Stamped. Filed. Waiting to be read aloud. The call came late in the afternoon, right as the city started to dim. Tobias didn't waste words. They've scheduled a joint session, he said. Creditors. Counsel. Mediation officer. Everyone in the same room. Everyone meant witnesses. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with awareness. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was exposure with an audience. They'll ask you to speak, Tobias continued. Not emotionally. Procedurally. They'll want confirmation. Confirmation of what had already been written. After the call, Ray sat across from me at the table, hands folded. This is the last quiet moment, she said. I nodded. She was right. Damien texted one final time that evening. No anger. No accusation. Just a line that felt smaller than everything before it. Please. Don't do this in front of people. I stared at the screen for a long time. Front of people. That was the fear. Not the truth, just the visibility of it. I typed a response. Then erased it. Because nothing I said could soften what was coming. And nothing I did would make it crueler than it already was. I went to bed early, but sleep came slowly. My mind replayed years of quiet fixes. Late nights. Silent payments. The way I'd been erased from every success while blamed for every inconvenience. Tomorrow, that imbalance would be named. Not by me. By records. By timelines. By questions Damien couldn't dodge anymore. I turned off the light and lay in the dark, steady and alert. And for the first time since my life split in two, I wasn't bracing myself. I was ready. Because when the truth finally enters the room, it doesn't need permission to speak. It just needs someone willing to let it. The conference room felt colder than it should have. Long table. Neutral walls. A clock ticking just loud enough to be noticed. This was the room where feelings stopped mattering. Damien arrived late. He looked different, careful, subdued, like someone who'd finally read the instructions after breaking the machine. Kiara wasn't with him. That absence said more than any statement could have. Across the table sat representatives I didn't know by name and didn't need to. Creditors. Counsel. A mediation officer whose job was to keep things procedural. Tobias sat beside me, calm and unreadable. Ray waited outside, close enough to feel steady. The mediation officer began with ground rules. No interruptions. Stick to facts. Speak when asked. Damien nodded too quickly. When it was my turn, I didn't give a speech. I answered questions. Yes, I made those payments. Yes, the accounts were joint. Yes, I stopped when I moved out. No, there was no agreement for me to continue. Each answer landed quietly. Permanently. Damien tried to reframe. He talked about stress. About misunderstanding. About how he thought things were handled. The words floated until they hit the records. The mediation officer asked him one question that changed the room. Can you explain why you didn't know the obligations existed if they were yours? Damien opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked at me like I might rescue him. I didn't. Silence stretched. Not hostile. Just factual. Tobias slid the binder across the table. Not theatrically. Precisely. Pages tabbed. Dates aligned. Numbers impossible to argue with. The room shifted. This wasn't a marital dispute anymore. It was an audit of dependency. And Damien was finally being asked to account for a life he'd never bothered to understand. I sat back, hands folded, heart steady. This wasn't exposure by accusation. It was exposure by record. And records don't raise their voice. They don't have to. The questions kept coming, but they weren't aimed at me anymore. They moved down the table, methodical and impersonal. Dates. Authorizations. Missed payments. Who had access? Who had oversight? Each answer narrowed the room around Damien. He tried to deflect once, gesturing toward me. She always handled that, he said, like it was a defense. The mediation officer didn't react. That's not an answer, she replied. That's a description. The difference mattered. A creditor asked when Damien last reviewed his own accounts. Damien hesitated, then guessed. The guess didn't match the statements. Another silence followed. This one heavier. I watched him realize, piece by piece, that no one in the room cared about his intentions. They cared about responsibility. At one point, he said, I trusted her. That word hung there, misplaced. Trust implies consent. Agreement. Mutual understanding. Tobias responded calmly. Reliance isn't the same as trust. And reliance without oversight is a liability. I didn't look at Damien then. I watched the mediator, Nasir Rockford, take notes. Those notes would outlive this room. A document was passed across the table. A summary of exposure. Not dramatic. Just comprehensive. Damien skimmed it too fast, then slower, as numbers refused to shrink. This reflects obligations accrued under your authority, Nasir said. And a lack of documented management on your part. Damien's shoulders slumped. Not in remorse. In realization. This wasn't about losing me. It was about losing the shield my silence had provided. When the session paused, Damien finally spoke to me directly. His voice was low. You could have warned me. I met his eyes. You told me I'd manage. Nasir called the room back to order. And the consequences continued, uninterrupted. By the afternoon break, the story was no longer Damien's to tell. Nasir summarized next steps in a tone that didn't bend. Formal review. Payment restructuring. Direct responsibility reassigned. Nothing was decided emotionally. Everything was decided procedurally. Damien stared at the table like answers might be etched into the grain. When Nasir explained that future communication would go directly to him, not through me, something finally cracked. I don't understand how it got this far, he muttered. No one responded. Understanding wasn't required. Compliance was. A creditor asked if there were additional records. Tobias nodded and referenced the binder again, this time highlighting recurring transfers that covered shortfalls. The implication was clear without being stated. This wasn't one missed payment. It was a system of quiet rescue. Damien tried to explain. I was focused on growth, he said. She was better with details. Nasir looked up. Delegation requires consent and oversight, she said. Neither is documented here. That sentence landed like a verdict. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just closure forming in real time. When the session adjourned for the day, Damien stood too quickly. He looked at me, then away. For the first time, he didn't ask me to fix anything. Outside the room, Ray waited. She didn't hug me. She smiled softly, like someone who knew the weight had shifted. Inside, paperwork was already moving forward. Plans. Conditions. Deadlines. Damien walked past me without speaking, phone already pressed to his ear, voice urgent again. But now, urgency didn't reach me. It stayed where it belonged. With him. And for the first time since I stopped managing, I understood something completely. Freedom doesn't arrive with applause. It arrives when no one needs you to hold everything together anymore. The formal notice arrived 3 days later. Not by email. By certified mail. Heavy envelope. Institutional language. The kind that doesn't soften its edges for comfort. I sat at Ray's table while Tobias walked me through it on speaker. The mediation outcome had been recorded. Damien was assigned sole responsibility for multiple obligations going forward. Payment plans established. Oversight required. Conditions attached. This removes ambiguity, Tobias said. And it removes you. That sentence felt like oxygen. One paragraph stood out. A clarification stating that my prior payments were voluntary and non-obligatory, with no expectation of continuation. It wasn't an apology. It was better. It was acknowledgement. Damien called that night. I let it ring out. He texted instead. They're treating me like I did this on purpose. I stared at the words, then set the phone down. Intent doesn't erase impact. The next day, Monisha sent another update. Short. Final. For sale sign went up. I hadn't expected that. I thought of the house, the furniture I chose, the rooms I managed, the structure I'd held steady. Now it was being reduced to square footage and listing price. Ray poured coffee and watched my face carefully. You okay? I am, I said. And this time, I didn't need to test the words. Because loss looks different when it's chosen by the person who caused it. That afternoon, Tobias forwarded one more message. Creditors had acknowledged receipt of the documentation. My name was removed from further correspondence. Your involvement is officially concluded, he wrote. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes. No more alerts. No more notices. No more silent responsibility. The system had finished adjusting. And it hadn't needed me to explain myself at all. It just needed the truth, written down. And the willingness to stop managing what was never mine to carry. The quiet that followed felt unfamiliar, like a room after furniture has been moved out. No ringing phone. No calendar alerts. No low-grade anxiety humming under everything I did. I woke up and realized there was nothing waiting for me to fix. That was new. I took a walk that morning without a destination. Chicago moved around me in its usual rhythm of traffic, conversations, steam rising from vents, but I felt slightly detached from it, like I'd stepped out of a role no one could recast me into. Ray noticed the shift before I named it. You're not scanning anymore, she said when I came back. You used to look like you were listening for alarms that never stopped. I smiled at that. It was true. Later that afternoon, Tamara called. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short, clipped, stripped of authority. I need to know what's happening, she said. Not can you help. Not please. Just confusion. For the first time, her confusion wasn't my responsibility. I deleted the message without replying. That evening, I sorted through the last box I'd brought from the house. Not everything, just the essentials. Papers. A few keepsakes. Proof of a life that had existed before it was reduced to logistics. At the bottom of the box was an old notebook. My handwriting filled the pages. Lists. Reminders. Fixes. Years of quiet management. I flipped through it slowly, then closed it. Some things are meant to be archived, not continued. I placed the notebook back in the box and sealed it. Not out of anger. Out of completion. Because the chapter where I existed to hold everything together was over. And nothing had collapsed around me. Only the parts that were never standing on their own to begin with. The mediation follow-up arrived without ceremony. An email. Brief. Confirming that Damien had missed his first revised payment deadline. No judgment attached. Just notice. I forwarded it to Tobias without comment. He replied an hour later. Not your issue. That phrase still felt strange. Comforting, but unfamiliar. Ray and I sat on the balcony that evening, city noise drifting up between us. She asked the question she'd been careful not to ask before. Do you miss him? I thought about it honestly. I miss who I thought I was with, I said. Not who he actually was. Ray nodded. She didn't push. Later that night, Damien texted again. This time, there was no anger. No strategy. Just exhaustion. Their threatening enforcement. I stared at the screen. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt detached. Like watching weather from behind glass. I typed a response. Then erased it. Silence had already said everything. A week later, another notice arrived. This one confirming additional actions if compliance didn't improve. Formal language. Tight deadlines. No space for excuses. The system wasn't cruel. It was consistent. I realized then that Damien wasn't being punished. He was being measured. For the first time in his adult life, the outcomes matched his choices. That weekend, I helped Ray rearrange her living room. We moved furniture. Changed the light. Made space. It felt symbolic without trying to be. As I lifted a chair, I laughed unexpectedly. The sound surprised me. Ray looked over. There she is, she said. I smiled, breathless but steady. I wasn't lighter because he was struggling. I was lighter because I wasn't compensating anymore. There's a difference. And once you feel it, you don't confuse it for anything else. Not guilt. Not nostalgia. Not love. The public part arrived quietly, the way real consequences usually do. A notice went up in the local listings. Not dramatic. Just factual. A brief mention of business restructuring tied to missed obligations. No names highlighted. No story told. But people who knew how to read it understood exactly what it meant. Ray showed it to me on her phone. This is how it spreads, she said. Not gossip. Confirmation. I nodded. Reputation doesn't collapse in a moment. It thins. Credibility leaks out through small, undeniable facts. Later that week, I ran into someone I hadn't seen in years at the grocery store. A mutual acquaintance. She hesitated, then said, I heard things were complicated. I smiled politely. They were. She nodded, relief crossing her face. Like she'd been waiting for permission to believe what she'd already seen. That night, Damien emailed again. Not asking for help. Not blaming me. Just explaining. Paragraphs of it. Context. Stress. Pressure. How fast things spiraled. I didn't read past the first screen. Explanations are for people who still have influence. I archived the email and went back to my book. The next morning, Monisha texted one last update. Moving truck at the house. Looks final. I felt a pause in my chest, not grief, exactly. Recognition. An ending doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just finishes. That afternoon, I took a folder I'd been carrying around and placed it in a drawer at the back of my desk. Not locked. Just set aside. I didn't need to keep proof close anymore. The truth was already out there, moving on its own. And I didn't need to chase it. Because when you stop managing the fallout, life starts managing itself again. Quietly. Without asking you to hold everything together. The last formal interaction came sooner than I expected. A brief notice from Tobias. Damien's attorney had withdrawn. Not with explanation. Just confirmation. Representation ended. That usually means funds or credibility, Tobias said when I called. Sometimes both. I thanked him and ended the call without needing reassurance. Later that day, I passed the old house by accident. Traffic rerouted me down the familiar street, and there it was emptier than I remembered. Curtains gone. Yard neglected. A place that had once looked stable now looked paused, like it was waiting for someone else to decide what it would become. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down either. That surprised me. Ray noticed when I told her later. That's how you know it's done, she said. You didn't need to look back. That evening, Damien called one final time. I almost didn't recognize the number. I answered out of curiosity, not obligation. I lost the house, he said. No greeting. No anger. Just a statement. I know, I replied. A long pause followed. Then, quieter, I didn't think you'd really leave everything behind. I considered that. I didn't leave everything, I said. I left what wasn't mine. He exhaled shakily. I don't know how to fix this. I didn't rush to fill the silence. When I spoke, my voice was calm. You're not supposed to fix it, I said. You're supposed to face it. He didn't argue. When the call ended, I set the phone down and felt nothing dramatic. No surge. No regret. Just completion. Some endings don't come with closure conversations or apologies. They come with clarity. And clarity, once reached, doesn't need to be defended. It simply stands. The space where anger used to live stayed empty. I noticed it one morning while making coffee. No tightness in my chest. No replaying conversations. No urge to check my phone for updates that no longer mattered. The absence felt earned. Ray sat across from me, scrolling through her tablet. You know what's wild, she said. Nothing followed you. I understood what she meant. No chaos. No backlash. No dramatic fallout chasing me down the street. When people stop managing other people's lives, the mess doesn't move with them. It stays where it was created. That afternoon, I went to the bank to open an account in my name only. The process was simple. Quiet. The clerk didn't know my history, and that felt like relief. I walked out with paperwork that belonged solely to me. Ownership feels different when it isn't shared with expectation. Later, I cleaned out my email. Archived threads. Old reminders. Messages that once demanded attention. Each deletion felt like a small release, not erasure but permission. Damien didn't reach out again. Neither did Tamara. Silence settled in naturally, without effort. That evening, Ray and I cooked dinner together. Nothing fancy. Just food made without urgency. She raised her glass and said, to accuracy. I laughed softly. To not managing. We ate in comfortable quiet. As the night stretched on, I realized something important. I hadn't won by taking something from Damien. I'd won by returning everything that wasn't mine. The labor. The responsibility. The illusion of control. What stayed with me was lighter. Cleaner. And for the first time in a long while, my life felt proportional. Not overextended. Not borrowed. Just mine. A few weeks later, I walked past a small park near Ray's place and sat on a bench I'd never noticed before. The trees were starting to change, leaves turning quietly without asking permission. Life doing what it does when no one is forcing it to hold still. I thought about the last thing Damien had ever said to me that mattered. You'll manage. He wasn't wrong. I did manage. I managed to leave without burning anything down. I managed to tell the truth without raising my voice. I managed to stop carrying what was never meant to be mine. What I didn't do was rescue him. And that distinction changed everything. I no longer measured my days by what needed fixing. I didn't scan rooms for tension or listen for problems forming. My time belonged to me again, unassigned and unclaimed. People talk about forgiveness like it's a gift you owe someone else. I didn't forgive Damien in the way stories usually mean it. I didn't need to. Justice had already arrived, quietly and thoroughly, and it hadn't asked me to soften it. What I did give myself was release. Release from explanation. Release from obligation. Release from managing other people's choices. I stood up from the bench and started walking, feeling the ground steady beneath my feet. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was honest. Somewhere behind me, a life built on my silence had collapsed under its own weight. Ahead of me was something simpler. A life where effort matched reward. Where responsibility followed authority. Where love didn't require erasure. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The door had already closed, softly, finally, and this time, I was the one who decided not to hold it open. If you liked this story, please like, subscribe, and share it. If you have a unique story of your own, share it in the comments below. Thank you for listening.